So the questions that we had when we first began our seminar class with Professors Daly and Rhonda Sharp were, first, are there major differences between wages in the public sector versus the private sector in India? And what do those differences look like? Specifically, can we find any patterns that can we identify any patterns between those differences? And more importantly, is there evidence of caste-based discrimination in either the private or public sector, or both? And what shape does that take? What does that look like? And if there is evidence of caste-based discrimination, is it wage discrimination? So if we have a member of a higher caste and a member of perhaps a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe performing the same job, is their pay scale different? Is there discrimination there? Or is there job discrimination? Are lower caste or scheduled castes prevented from entering certain industries or certain higher level jobs or occupations? So that kind of led us on this path of research. Now I know we have several scholars here from India, so I certainly don't need to educate you on the Indian caste system, but I do want to just briefly go over, since there's so many ways to categorize caste in India, I just want to touch on how we looked at the caste system and how we kind of broke it down for the purposes of our research. So basically we have the Brahmin and other high castes. We have the OBCs, Dalits, Vasis, and then the data we use, which I'll be discussing in a moment, also included groups based on religion. So we also had Muslims, Sikh, and Jain, which were included in one category, and then also Christians. So we thought, why not, we'll include that in our research as well and see if we can find any identifying patterns. So as Mike Patel discussed in his presentation yesterday, a lot of legislative action has taken place in India, especially since the 1920s, in order to kind of correct for the inequalities that are faced by lower castes. And that has included equal rights laws and acts, particularly in access to health, education, and politics, and it has also included the reservation system. But as he pointed out, as well as Dr. Bharat, the reservation system is only mandatory in the public sector and still remains on a voluntary basis in the private sector. So to kind of give an overview of the literature that exists in this field, we have in 2005, Vani Barua, and you'll have to excuse me as I kind of butcher my way through these names. I'm not very affluent in terms of pronouncing them, but so in 2005, Vani Barua, after accounting for differences in capital and skill endowments, estimated that at least 1/3 of the differences in average incomes between higher Hindu castes and scheduled tribes could actually be due to discrimination in the workplace. And a couple years later, Takahiro Ito also wanted to quantify this type of discrimination in the labor market, and he found that particularly job discrimination, which is when, obviously lower castes are being kept out of certain industries or markets, that it seems to still be quite a problem in India, and could explain why social or scheduled tribes and scheduled castes are underrepresented in certain higher level positions. Also in 2007, Madheswaran and Atwell used several decomposition methods and found that discrimination in the public sector has somewhat steadily decreased over the past several decades, but has actually remained constant and high in the private sector. That approximately 15% of the wage differential between the two caste types, non-scheduled caste and scheduled caste, could be accounted for by discrimination. This obviously has strong parallels with both Dr. Bharat's work as well as Dr. Deshpande's work. And he actually was presenting on it yesterday, which was great. So our intended contribution with our research was basically we wanted to test these findings using a different set of data. We also wanted to extend our analysis to include the rural sector, as Madheswaran and Atwell paper mostly looked at more highly educated employees in the urban sector. And so we wanted to use that also included the rural sector. And then we also wanted to broaden the scope of the research, including more caste types and groups, as well as the inclusion of different religious groups. the data we used was actually the India Human Development Survey. We used the 2005 version of the data. There's been a more recent 2011, but the data itself is not available for another year, which was a pretty extensive survey that gathered information on household characteristics, including employment, income, caste type, obviously, and health, covering several villages and urban neighborhoods throughout the country. So what we kind of thought going into this was, based on the existing literature, we expected that we would be able to find some kind of evidence of caste-based discrimination, either wage or job, or both. We also assumed that we would probably find it in both sectors, but that it would have a much higher presence in the private sector. And in doing so, we decided to control for occupation type as well as caste or religious type, then again for private versus public. And we sought to estimate the relationship between caste and income levels, as well as any wage differences across caste and religions and between public and private sectors. So, as it often happens when you're doing empirical research, you don't always get all your questions answered. One question that we weren't able to answer is, could we identify any patterns among wage differentials between the private and public sector across different castes? But we did find some interesting things. We found that actually, even when occupation type is controlled for, higher castes as well as Christians have higher mean incomes than OBCs, Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims. We also found that being a part of the Adivasi, Dalit, or OBC caste actually had a negative impact on your wage level, with logged wages. And more importantly, this negative relationship was statistically significant. We also found a statistically significant negative relationship between being female and your income, which is unsurprising. And finally, that wages are higher in the public sector for all caste groups except for other religious groups, which we found a little interesting, but could be due perhaps to the fact that a lot of these legislative actions have been based on trying to remedy inequalities based on caste rather than religion. So that could account for why we see those differentials. So finally, while we weren't able to find distinguishing patterns among wage differentials separated by caste, our findings are quite consistent with the previous studies that I mentioned. Mainly that caste-based discrimination seems to remain a huge problem in India, particularly in the private sector. And this includes the rural sector as well, which is interesting considering that the government has employment programs, including the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which is an effort basically to include more lower caste in inconsistent income and inconsistent wage and jobs. So it's interesting that we were able to find that. Basically, what this means then is that caste-based discrimination continues to be an important topic of discussion for the public, for policymakers, and what begs the question really is, what more can be done? Is the legislative acts, are they doing enough? Are they having a big enough impact? And what else can be added to that system in order to create the more equal space that we have been discussing in this conference? Like I said, are they achieving enough impact? And to continue our research, we would also like to look further into specifically job discrimination, which I touched on. We would like to use mostly a multinomial probability model for further research to distinguish if we can find a pattern between your caste type and the probability of being in a certain income percentile or being in a particular industry. And so we'd like to test further for job discrimination. And we'd also like to see if we could find any interesting patterns across time. So once the 2011 version of the India Human Development Survey is released, we'd like to be able to see if we could see any differences in discrimination between those 6 years and how those changes have taken place and if they've improved, if they've worsened, basically how that has changed. Because it's important to be able to identify discrimination in the here and now, but it's also equally important important, if not more, to see how it's changed over time. So that's something that we also like to further.
Hey, what's happening?
Brother, what's up?
This is a groovy party, man.
Yeah,
I
brother,
can dig
like,
it.
solid. Right on.